Pietro Calabrese has been maitre d' at Villa Rosa for 6 years, and in those 6 years, he's turned away dozens of Negro customers trying to dine at an establishment that doesn't serve their kind. December 15th, 1936, at 7:30 p.m., he turns away another one, a well-dressed Negro man with 3 companions and a female date. The man doesn't argue, doesn't threaten, doesn't cause a scene. He just looks at Calabrese with eyes that seem to be memorizing every detail, says, "I'll remember that policy," and walks away into the December evening. Calabrese returns to his work seating white customers at white-clothed tables, completely unaware that he has just made the most expensive professional mistake of his life. 3 days later, December 18th, 1936, Calabrese arrives at Villa Rosa for his evening shift and discovers that the Negro man he turned away now owns the restaurant, owns the building, owns the tables, owns Calabrese's job, and Calabrese has a choice: quit immediately or stay and serve the same people he spent 6 years turning away from the door. He stays because he needs the job, because it's the Depression and work is scarce, because Bumpy Johnson, the new owner whose name Calabrese now knows, the man he turned away 72 hours earlier, is paying the same wages Benedetti paid. But every night, every shift, every time Calabrese bows slightly to seat a Negro customer at a table that 3 days ago was reserved only for whites, he remembers. Remembers the moment he said, "We don't serve coloreds here." Remembers the look in Johnson's eyes. Remembers not knowing that those 5 words would cost his boss an $18,000 restaurant in 72 hours. This is the story of what happens when you underestimate who you're talking to. When you treat a man worth over $2 million like he's worth nothing. When you forget that in 1936 Harlem, Bumpy Johnson isn't asking for permission to dine anywhere. He's deciding whether to let you keep owning the place that denied him. But the story everyone in Harlem is telling on December 18th, the story that will be repeated in barbershops and policy banks and church basements for the next 30 years, isn't really about a restaurant transaction. It's about what happens when someone makes the catastrophic miscalculation of treating Bumpy Johnson like he's still that hungry kid from Charleston instead of the man who, by December 1936, controls more money and power than most white businessmen in Manhattan will see in their entire lives. It's about the 72 hours between humiliation and retribution, between being told, "We don't serve your kind" here, and owning the establishment that said it. Between racism and revenge executed so perfectly that it becomes legend. This is the story nobody tells when they talk about Bumpy Johnson's rise to power. The story that demonstrates more clearly than any number of policy banks or mob negotiations exactly who Bumpy Johnson was by 1936. The story of how 3 words spoken by a white maitre d' on a cold December evening set in motion a chain of events that would result in one of the most talked-about property acquisitions in Harlem history. The story of pride, power, and the kind of revenge that doesn't involve violence but is far more devastating because it's permanent. For the first time, we've spoken with people who were there that December evening in 1936. The waiters who watched the initial confrontation, the lawyers who handled the paperwork during those frantic 72 hours, the former employees of Villa Rosa who watched their workplace change ownership in less time than it takes most people to close on a home. The Harlem residents who witnessed Bumpy Johnson proved that by December 1936, there was literally nothing in Harlem that he couldn't own if someone was foolish enough to tell him he couldn't have it. And their testimonies reveal not just a story about a restaurant transaction, but a story about power, respect, and the exact moment when Harlem's most powerful crime boss demonstrated that discrimination against him would cost more than any racist policy was worth. And Bumpy Johnson is walking toward Villa Rosa with 3 associates and a date for the evening, a school teacher named Charlotte Williams, who teaches at PS 89 and who has agreed to dinner after meeting Bumpy at a Harlem Renaissance poetry reading 2 weeks earlier. The temperature is 34 degrees. Snow is falling, lightly. The city is decorated for Christmas. Villa Rosa, located at the corner of 116th Street and Pleasant Avenue in what locals call Italian Harlem, has a reputation for serving the best osso buco north of Little Italy, and for having tableside service that rivals restaurants in Midtown Manhattan that charge twice as much. Bumpy loved good food, remembers Jerome Littleman Taylor, 84, who was one of the three associates walking with Johnson that evening. By 1936, Bumpy was eating at the finest restaurants in Harlem and Manhattan. He had the money to eat anywhere he wanted. He knew wines. He knew Italian cooking. He appreciated good service. This wasn't some kid off the street trying to get into a place he couldn't afford. The group approaches the entrance. December light spills from the large windows. Through the glass, you can see white tablecloths, candles, well-dressed diners, waiters in black vests carrying trays of pasta and wine. This is the Harlem that Italian immigrants built. The Harlem that by 1936 has over 100,000 Italian residents, 3 times the size of Little Italy downtown. The Harlem where Italian restaurants serve Italian customers and where the unwritten rules about who belongs and who doesn't are as rigid as any Jim Crow law in the South. Bumpy reaches for the door. Before his hand touches the brass handle, a man in a dark suit emerges from inside. This is Pietro Calabrese, the maitre d', 43 years old, employed at Villa Rosa for 6 years, and he positions himself in front of the door with body language that communicates everything before he speaks a single word. "I'm sorry, but we don't serve coloreds here," Calabrese says in English, with an Italian accent that 19 witnesses will later recall in remarkably consistent testimony. Time stops. Not dramatically, not with the movie-style tension of a confrontation that's about to explode into violence. Time stops because everyone present, Italian diners looking through the window, Bumpy's associates, passers-by on 116th Street, everyone recognizes immediately that something significant is happening. Everyone except Pietro Calabrese apparently understands that you don't tell Bumpy Johnson in December 1936 that he's not welcome somewhere in Harlem. Bumpy didn't say anything at first, recalls Taylor. He just looked at this maitre d' like he was studying him, like he was taking a photograph with his mind. Then he looked past him into the restaurant, looked at all the white folks eating their pasta, looked back at the maitre d', and he smiled. Not a friendly smile. Johnson asks quietly. "It's the owner's policy," Calabrese responds, his confidence wavering slightly because Bumpy Johnson isn't arguing, isn't angry, isn't doing anything except asking questions with the calm interest of someone gathering information. This is an Italian restaurant for Italian people. What happens next is recounted by multiple witnesses with near-identical details. Then he turns and walks away. No threats, no violence, no scene. He just leaves with his group, walking north on Pleasant Avenue toward 117th Street, where there's a Negro-owned restaurant called Mama Rosa's that serves soul food, and where Bumpy Johnson and his companions will have dinner instead, though Charlotte Williams will later tell friends that Bumpy barely touched his food, barely spoke during the meal, just sat there with that smile on his face like he was working out a complicated mathematics problem in his head. 85, son of the gangster who first brought young Ellsworth Johnson into Harlem's criminal underworld. And I'm telling you, the most dangerous version of Bumpy wasn't the one who fought you. It was the one who smiled at you and walked away. The anger that he kept perfectly controlled at Villa Rosa has transformed into something more powerful. Determination. By midnight on December 15th, 1936, Bumpy Johnson has decided that Villa Rosa will change ownership. The only question is how quickly he can make it happen. This isn't about wanting Italian food. Bumpy Johnson can eat Italian food at a dozen restaurants in Manhattan, where his money and his reputation open doors that his skin color theoretically should keep closed. This is about something deeper, about the principle that in his Harlem, on his streets, in the neighborhood where he's built power through intelligence and strategy and sheer force of will, Nobody gets to tell him he's not good enough to sit at their table. Nobody gets to make him walk away. Nobody gets to humiliate him and keep operating their business like nothing happened. When people talk about Bumpy's rise to power, they focus on the violence or the numbers racket or his deal with Lucky Luciano, says Theodore Green, 79, who would later become Johnson's attorney, but in 1936 was a young law clerk who got pulled into the Villa Rosa transaction. But this restaurant thing showed a different kind of power. The morning of December 16th, 1936, approximately 16 hours after being turned away from Villa Rosa, Bumpy Johnson is sitting in a diner on 125th Street with three men. The first is Nathaniel Nat Pettigrew, his closest advisor and the man who manages most of Johnson's legitimate business interests. The second is Samuel Cohen, a 48-year-old Jewish attorney who handles real estate transactions for several of Harlem's most successful Negro businessmen and who has a reputation for closing deals that other lawyers claim are impossible. The third is Marco Esposito, 39 years old, an Italian-American associate of the Genovese crime family who works as a liaison between the Italian mob and Harlem's Negro criminal enterprises. Bumpy laid it out very simply. Remembers Pettigrew, 82, speaking from his home in Queens, where he moved in 1975. He said, "There's an Italian restaurant on 116th and Pleasant, Villa Rosa. It was Wednesday morning. That gave us about 60 hours. Cohen immediately starts talking about how property transactions take weeks minimum, how there are inspections and title searches and negotiations, and Bumpy just looked at him and said, "I don't want to hear what takes weeks." What follows over the next 72 hours is a masterclass in how power actually works in 1936 Harlem. Not the power of violence, though that's always an implicit threat in the background. Not the power of politics, though Bumpy has aldermen and police captains on his payroll. This is the power of money, connections, pressure, and strategic thinking, all deployed with the kind of precision that built Johnson's estimated $2 million empire in the first place. The first move is information gathering. By noon on December 16th, Cohen's assistant has pulled property records showing that Villa Rosa is owned by Angelo Benedetti, 56 years old, who purchased the property in 1928 for $12,000 and who has a mortgage of $4,200 with First Italian Bank of Harlem. Benedetti also has two other properties, both rental buildings on 115th Street, worth approximately $8,000 each. His total net worth is estimated at $35,000, comfortable by 1936 standards, but not wealthy. The restaurant does steady business but isn't wildly profitable. Annual revenues approximately $45,000, annual profit after expenses approximately $8,000. Once we had the numbers, the strategy became clear, says Cohen, now 87, speaking from his retirement home in Florida. Benedetti wasn't a rich man. The restaurant was probably his most valuable asset besides his rental properties. If we offered him enough cash to walk away, enough to buy another property somewhere else and maybe retire comfortable, he'd have to seriously consider it. The second move is applying pressure through the Italian connection. This is where Marco Esposito becomes essential. Esposito has worked with Bumpy Johnson since 1935, when Johnson negotiated his landmark deal with Lucky Luciano that gave Johnson control of Harlem's rackets in exchange for a percentage paid to the Italian mob. Esposito's job is to make it clear to Benedetti that selling quickly is in everyone's best interest. Marco went to see Benedetti that same Wednesday afternoon, recalls Pettigrew. Not to threaten him. Marco was very clear about that, just to explain the situation. To let Benedetti know that Bumpy Johnson wanted to purchase Villa Rosa, that a generous offer would be made, and that Mr. Johnson would appreciate a swift resolution. The implication was obvious. You don't tell Bumpy Johnson no, not in Harlem. Angelo Benedetti's version of these events, recorded in an interview with Harlem newspaper Amsterdam News in 1951, 15 years after the transaction, confirms the sequence. A man came to see me on Wednesday. Italian man, very polite, very respectful. He explained that Mr. Johnson wished to purchase my restaurant. He said an offer would be made and that I should consider it carefully. I asked what would happen if I refused to sell. He smiled and said nothing would happen, but that Mr. Johnson had never been refused anything in Harlem, and it would be unfortunate to be the first. By Wednesday evening, December 16th, Samuel Cohen has prepared an offer, $18,000 cash for Villa Rosa, including the building, all equipment, all inventory, the name, the recipes, everything. This is approximately 50% more than the property's assessed value of $12,000. It's enough above market rate to be compelling, but not so high as to seem desperate. The offer comes with conditions. Benedetti has 24 hours to accept. If he accepts, closing must happen within 48 hours. All of this is highly irregular. Real estate transactions in 1936 don't close this quickly, but the offer makes it clear that speed is being purchased along with the property. I took the offer to Benedetti Thursday morning, recalls Cohen. He was standing behind the bar of Villa Rosa, and I could see he'd been up all night thinking about it. He looked at the number, $18,000, and I watched him do the calculation in his head. He owed $4,200 on the mortgage. That left him with $13,800 clear. That's more than he'd make in 2 years running the restaurant. That's enough to buy another property outright. That's enough to retire if he's careful. I didn't have to sell him on anything. But Angelo Benedetti, standing in his restaurant on Thursday morning, December 17th, 1936, is not just calculating money. He's calculating risk. He knows who Bumpy Johnson is. Everyone in Harlem knows who Bumpy Johnson is by December 1936. The man who stood up to Dutch Schultz. The man who negotiated with Lucky Luciano as an equal. The man who controls the numbers racket that generates millions of dollars annually across Harlem. The man who apparently doesn't forget being turned away from a restaurant by a maitre d' who was just following the owner's policy. I sold because I'm not a fool, Benedetti said in that 1951 interview. I sold because $18,000 in cash is more money than most people see in a lifetime. I sold because the alternative was keeping a restaurant in a problems neighborhood where the most powerful Negro criminal in America had decided he wanted to own it. You think my white customers would keep coming if they knew Bumpy Johnson was unhappy with me? You think the suppliers would keep delivering? You think the police would keep looking the other way at the illegal wine I served during Prohibition? I sold because when Bumpy Johnson wants to buy your restaurant in 1936 Harlem, you don't negotiate. Thursday afternoon, December 17th, Benedetti signs the purchase offer. Title search that normally takes a week. Cohen has a clerk working overnight to verify the property records, paying triple overtime to get results by Friday morning. Property inspection that normally takes several days. Bumpy sends his own contractor who completes a walkthrough in 4 hours and delivers a written report. Mortgage satisfaction that normally requires coordination with the bank. Bumpy delivers $4,200 in cash to First Italian Bank of Harlem on Friday morning and receives the satisfaction documents by Friday afternoon. The bank manager was shocked, remembers Vincent DeMarco, 88, who worked as a teller at First Italian Bank in 1936. We had a customer walk in with $4,200 in cash, paying off someone else's mortgage. That wasn't a normal transaction. But the money was real. The paperwork was in order. In Samuel Cohen's office on 135th Street. Present are Bumpy Johnson, Angelo Benedetti, Samuel Cohen, 2 witnesses, and a notary public. The paperwork is straightforward. Benedetti signs the deed transfer. Johnson hands over a cashier's check for $18,000 from Harlem Savings Bank. The notary stamps the documents. M. On December 18th, 1936, exactly 71 hours and 13 minutes after being told, "We don't serve coloreds here," Bumpy Johnson owns Villa Rosa. Benedetti couldn't get out of there fast enough, recalls Cohen. He took the check, shook Bumpy's hand, and left. He cleared his personal belongings out of the restaurant that same evening. The transformation of Villa Rosa from a whites-only Italian restaurant to a Negro-owned integrated establishment happened so quickly that some regular customers don't even realize ownership has changed until they arrive for dinner Saturday evening and see Negro patrons seated at tables that had never before served anyone who wasn't white. I was a waiter at Villa Rosa for 3 years, says Giovanni Russo, 81, speaking from his home in Brooklyn. Thursday night, I'm serving Italian customers, like always. Friday, we're told the restaurant is sold. Saturday morning, there's a new owner, and he's a Negro man, and by Saturday evening, I'm serving Negro and white customers both. The strangest part? Nothing else changed. Same menu. Same recipes, same wine list, same tablecloths, just different people sitting at the tables. The immediate response in Harlem is electric. Word spreads through the neighborhood faster than news of a policy hit. Bumpy Johnson bought Villa Rosa, bought it in 3 days, bought it because they wouldn't serve him. The story grows with each retelling, becomes legend before it's even a week old. This is the Bumpy Johnson that Harlem wants to believe in. Not just the criminal, not just the numbers banker, but the man who refuses to accept discrimination, who converts humiliation into ownership, who demonstrates that by December 1936, there is literally nothing in Harlem that money and power can't purchase if someone is foolish enough to try to deny him access. The Villa Rosa purchase was brilliant because it was both revenge and business, explains Marcus Henderson, 72, a historian who has studied Harlem's criminal enterprises for over 40 years. Bumpy didn't just buy the restaurant to prove a point. He bought an asset. Villa Rosa was profitable. It was well located. It had a reputation for quality. He transformed a moment of discrimination into a sound business investment that also happened to humiliate the people who discriminated against him. That's the genius of Bumpy Johnson. He never let emotion override a bench. The financial details of Villa Rosa's operation under Johnson's ownership reveal a man who understood that owning a business meant running it properly. Johnson kept most of the existing staff, including waiters, kitchen staff, and eventually even Pietro Calabrese, the maitre d' who had initially turned him away. The menu remained Italian. The wine list remained extensive. The only changes were the integration of the dining room and improvements to the decor funded by Johnson's investment. Keeping Calabrese was a power move, says Theodore Green. Bumpy could have fired him. Everyone expected him to fire him, but instead, he kept him on and made him serve Negro customers with the same politeness he'd shown white customers. Made him bow and scrape to the same people he'd turned away. That was more satisfying than just firing him. Pietro Calabrese's perspective, recorded in a 1947 interview shortly before he left Harlem permanently, reveals a man who learned an expensive lesson. I was following the owner's orders when I turned Mr. Johnson away. I didn't know who he was. I didn't understand what I was doing. When he became the owner, he could have fired me. Instead, he made me maitre d' for Negro customers, made me treat them like royalty. Every night I worked, I remembered that I'd turned away the man who would become my boss within 72 hours. It was humiliating. It was also educational. I learned that power in Harlem wasn't about skin color. It was about respect. And the first year under Johnson's ownership, Villa Rosa's revenue increased 35%, from approximately $45,000 to approximately $61,000. This was partly due to Negro customers who finally had access to upscale Italian dining in Harlem, but it was also due to white customers, who were curious about the restaurant's new owner, who wanted to say they dined at Bumpy Johnson's establishment, who treated the integrated dining room as a kind of sophisticated rebellion against the segregation that dominated most of New York City in 1936. White folks loved to tell their friends they ate at Bumpy's place, remembers Taylor. It was like going to the Cotton Club to see Negro performers. It was a way to feel progressive and open-minded while still treating it like entertainment. But Bumpy didn't care about their motivations. He cared about their money. The Villa Rosa acquisition also sent a message throughout Harlem that had implications far beyond one restaurant. The message was simple. Bumpy Johnson was no longer a man who could be casually discriminated against. He was a man who would purchase your business out from under you if you made the mistake of treating him as less than equal, and he would do it so quickly you wouldn't have time to understand what was happening until the deed was transferred and you were standing on the street with a check in your hand, watching your former business operate without you. After Villa Rosa, I noticed a change in how white business owners in Harlem interacted with Bumpy, says Pettigrew. Before, there was always this assumption that even though Bumpy had money and power, he was still Negro, and therefore still had to accept certain limits on where he was welcome. After Villa Rosa, that assumption disappeared. Store owners invited him to shop. Restaurant owners reserved their best tables. Everyone suddenly remembered that in 1936, Harlem Bumpy Johnson was more than welcome. He was essential. The speed of the transaction also demonstrated Johnson's operational capabilities in ways that impressed even his Italian mob partners. Closing a property deal in 72 hours required coordination, legal expertise, financial resources, and the ability to apply pressure effectively without resorting to violence. These were the skills of a sophisticated businessman, not a street-level criminal. The skills that Lucky Luciano had recognized when he agreed to partner with Johnson in 1935. The skills that would allow Johnson to build and maintain his criminal empire for the next 3 decades. Lucky Luciano heard about the Villa Rosa deal, recalls Marco Esposito. He thought it was brilliant. He said any man who could buy a restaurant in 3 days just because they wouldn't serve him was a man you wanted as a partner, not an enemy. It reinforced Luciano's confidence that he'd made the right decision working with Bumpy. It showed that Bumpy understood power wasn't just about violence. It was about leverage. Financial leverage, political leverage, social leverage. For Charlotte Williams, the schoolteacher who had been with Johnson that December evening when he was turned away from Villa Rosa, the restaurant's acquisition was both impressive and troubling. Bumpy took me to Villa Rosa for dinner the Saturday after he purchased it, Williams recalled in a 1968 interview shortly after Johnson's death. We sat at the same table where white diners had been sitting the week before. The maitre d' who had turned us away now served us, with a politeness that bordered on fear. The food was excellent, the wine was expensive, and Bumpy was charming. But I kept thinking about what it meant that the fastest way to integrate a restaurant in Harlem wasn't through protest or legislation. It was through purchasing it. That's power. The question of what the Villa Rosa acquisition meant for the average Harlem resident, for the thousands of Negro citizens who didn't have $18,000 in cash to buy their way into establishments that discriminated against them, is one that historians still debate. Did Johnson's actions help the broader community by demonstrating Negro economic power? Or did they simply reinforce the reality that access to equal treatment in 1936 America was available only to those with enough money and power to purchase it? Bumpy opened Villa Rosa to all Negro customers, not just wealthy ones, argues Henderson, the historian. A working-class family could save up and have a special dinner there. In that sense, his ownership did benefit the community. But you're right that the method of achieving integration, purchasing the restaurant rather than demanding service as a matter of civil rights, revealed the limits of individual action. Bumpy could integrate one restaurant. He couldn't integrate American society. The Villa Rosa story also illuminates the complex relationship between Harlem's Negro community and the Italian community in East Harlem. By 1936, these communities existed side by side, sometimes collaborating economically, sometimes in conflict, always navigating the complicated dynamics of race, class, and power in Depression-era New York. Italians in Harlem weren't universally racist, says Rosa Giordano, 76, whose grandparents owned a bakery on 115th Street in the 1932nd. But there was definitely a hierarchy. Italians felt superior to Negroes because they were white, even though other white people often discriminated against Italians as inferior Europeans. When Bumpy bought Villa Rosa, it challenged that hierarchy. It showed that a Negro man could have more money and power than an Italian business owner. Some Italians respected that. Some resented it. The architectural and operational details of Villa Rosa under Johnson's ownership reveal a man who took pride in his acquisition. He invested an additional $3,000 in renovations during the first 6 months of ownership, upgrading the lighting, repainting the dining room in warm colors that made the space feel more inviting, and installing a small stage where jazz musicians would occasionally perform on weekend evenings, creating a hybrid Italian restaurant jazz club atmosphere that was unique in Harlem. Bumpy didn't just want to own Villa Rosa as a trophy, says Green, the attorney. He wanted it to be successful. He wanted it to represent the quality and sophistication of Negro ownership. He personally approved the menu changes. He sampled new wines for the wine list. He interviewed musicians before they were allowed to perform. This wasn't a absentee owner collecting profits. The staff dynamics at Villa Rosa after the ownership change were complex and revealing. Some Italian staff members quit immediately, unwilling to work for a Negro owner. Others stayed, motivated by the need for employment during the Depression and by Johnson's reputation for paying above-market wages. And some stayed because they developed genuine respect for Johnson as a boss who ran his business professionally and treated employees fairly. I stayed because I needed the job, admits Giovanni Russo, the waiter, but also, I stayed because Mr. Johnson was a good boss. Better than Benedetti in some ways. He paid on time. He didn't steal tips. He cared if the restaurant succeeded. After a few months, I stopped thinking of him as a Negro boss and started thinking of him as just the boss. That was his real achievement at Villa Rosa, not that he bought it. 50. Expensive by 1936 standards, when the average Harlem household earned about $30 per week. This pricing strategy meant that Villa Rosa remained an establishment for special occasions rather than everyday dining, but it also meant that Johnson was running a profitable business rather than a charity. People sometimes criticized Bumpy for not making Villa Rosa more affordable for working-class families, says Henderson, but he was running a business, not a social program. The pricing had to support the quality of food, the service, the overhead, and honestly, the fact that it was upscale made it more valuable as a statement. This wasn't just a Negro-owned restaurant. This was a Negro-owned upscale Italian restaurant with white tablecloths and an extensive wine list. The relationship between Johnson and Angelo Benedetti after the sale is documented through several sources, and it reveals a transaction that both men understood was about more than just real estate. Benedetti moved to New Jersey in 1937, purchased a smaller restaurant in Newark with the proceeds from the Villa Rosa sale, and by all accounts, lived comfortably until his death in 1963. He never publicly expressed resentment about the quick sale, though in private conversations, friends reported that he felt he'd been pressured into a transaction he wouldn't have made under other circumstances. Benedetti knew he'd been outmaneuvered, says Cohen, the attorney who handled the transaction, but he also knew he'd been fairly compensated. $18,000 was a good price. He wasn't cheated financially. He was just reminded that in 1936, Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's desire to own something was more powerful than anyone else's desire to keep it. That's not illegal. For Bumpy Johnson, the Villa Rosa acquisition represented something more personal than the business and political calculations that motivated most of his actions. It represented the distance he'd traveled from that one 4-year-old boy, arriving in Harlem in 1919 with nothing, knowing he was unwelcome in most establishments because of his skin color. By December 1936, he'd achieved enough power that being unwelcome somewhere meant he could simply purchase it. The Villa Rosa thing stuck with Bumpy for the rest of his life, says Pettigrew. Not because it was his most important acquisition. He bought and sold dozens of properties over the years that were worth more money and more strategically valuable. But Villa Rosa was personal. It was about respect. It was about proving that by 1936, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson wasn't someone who could be turned away from anywhere in Harlem. The timing of the Villa Rosa acquisition is also significant within the broader context of Johnson's life and career. December 1936 is just 1 year after Dutch Schultz's death, 1 year after Johnson negotiated his landmark deal with Lucky Luciano. This is Johnson at the peak of his early power, before his first major prison sentence in 1952. This is Johnson, as a young man, 31 years old, with money and influence and the kind of confidence that comes from having risen from nothing to controlling a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise in less than 2 decades. In 1936, Bumpy was at the height of his powers, says Henderson. He was young enough to be physically imposing, old enough to have earned respect through experience, wealthy enough to make things happen quickly, connected enough to apply pressure through multiple channels. The Villa Rosa acquisition happened when it did because that's when Bumpy had all the resources necessary to make it happen in 72 hours. 5 years earlier, he might not have had the cash. 5 years later, he'd be more cautious about drawing attention to himself. The legal implications of the transaction were straightforward, but the social and political implications rippled through Harlem for years. Johnson had demonstrated that integration could be achieved through economic power, that discrimination could be countered not just through protest but through purchase, that respect in America in 1936 might be more attainable through money than through moral arguments about equality. The Villa Rosa acquisition influenced how other Negro business owners thought about expansion, says Samuel Morrison, 68, whose grandfather owned a funeral home in Harlem in the 1932nd. Before, there was an assumption that certain types of businesses, upscale restaurants, certain retail stores, certain service businesses weren't appropriate for Negro ownership because white customers wouldn't patronize them. Villa Rosa challenged that assumption. The physical space of Villa Rosa remained largely unchanged during Johnson's ownership. The mahogany bar that Benedetti had imported from Italy in 1929 stayed. The murals of Italian countryside scenes painted by a local artist stayed. Even the Italian-language menus stayed, though Johnson added English translations. This preservation of the restaurant's Italian character was deliberate. Johnson wasn't trying to transform Villa Rosa into something it wasn't. He was proving that a Negro man could own and operate an Italian establishment while maintaining its authenticity and quality. Some people expected Bumpy to change everything, to make it more Negro, says Russo. But he didn't. He kept the Italian recipes, kept the Italian waiters who stayed, kept the Italian decor. The only thing he changed was who was allowed to eat there. That was the most radical change possible: integration without transformation. The financial success of Villa Rosa under Johnson's ownership continued throughout his active years in Harlem. The restaurant operated profitably until 1952, when Johnson's 15-year prison sentence for drug conspiracy meant he had to sell many of his legitimate business holdings to pay legal expenses and support his family during his incarceration. Villa Rosa sold in 1953 to another Italian-American owner for $35,000, nearly double what Johnson paid for it in 1936, reflecting both the property's increased value and the improvements Johnson had made during his 16 years of ownership. The fact that Villa Rosa continued to be valuable after Bumpy sold it proves he ran it well, says Green. He didn't just own it as a statement, he owned it as a business. He maintained its value. He increased its profitability. When he had to sell because of his legal troubles, he walked away with nearly 100% profit on his initial investment. The employees who worked at Villa Rosa during Johnson's ownership years speak of him with a mixture of fear, respect, and, surprisingly often, affection. He was a demanding boss who expected excellence in service, food quality, and customer treatment. But he was also a boss who paid fairly, who protected his employees from outside trouble, who made sure the restaurant was maintained properly, who took pride in what his establishment represented, asks Russo. Of course, everyone knew Bumpy Johnson ran numbers, worked with the mob, did things that weren't legal. But at Villa Rosa, he was just the owner. He wasn't running policy operations out of the restaurant. He wasn't using it as a front. It was a legitimate business that he owned and operated legally. That separation between his criminal enterprises and his legitimate businesses was important to him. He wanted Villa Rosa to be respectable. The cultural significance of Villa Rosa in Harlem society during the Johnson years cannot be overstated. It became a destination for Negro professionals, artists, intellectuals, and middle-class families who wanted to celebrate special occasions at an establishment that represented the best of what Negro ownership could achieve. Graduation dinners, anniversary celebrations, business meetings, all took place in a dining room that had once refused to serve Negro customers but now welcomed them as valued patrons. My parents took me to Villa Rosa for my high school graduation in 1947, remembers Dorothy Hamilton, 77. It was the fanciest meal I'd ever had. My father wore his best suit. My mother wore pearls. We ate pasta and drank wine and felt like we were at the finest restaurant in Manhattan. The fact that it was owned by Bumpy Johnson made it even more special. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was a symbol. It was proof that we belonged in nice places, that we could own nice places. The broader political context of 1936 makes the Villa Rosa acquisition even more significant. This is the year that Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals at the Berlin Olympics, challenging Nazi theories of racial superiority while facing discrimination at home. This is 2 years before Marian Anderson was denied the right to perform at Constitution Hall because of her race. This is a decade before Jackie Robinson integrated baseball. The Villa Rosa acquisition was one small private act of integration in a decade when segregation was still legal, still enforced, still considered acceptable by millions of Americans. Bumpy wasn't a civil rights leader, argues Henderson. He wasn't trying to change American society through moral persuasion or political organizing, but his actions had political implications. When he bought Villa Rosa, when he integrated that dining room, when he proved that Negro ownership of upscale establishments was not only possible but profitable, he was challenging segregation in a practical way that complemented the work of activists and organizers. Integration through economic power rather than through moral argument. The relationship between the Villa Rosa acquisition and Johnson's broader business strategy reveals a man who understood that diversification of assets and income streams was essential for long-term success. By 1936, Johnson's criminal enterprises, primarily the numbers racket, generated the majority of his income. But he also owned rental properties, invested in legitimate businesses, and maintained relationships with legitimate Negro business owners who respected his financial acumen, even if they disapproved of his criminal activities. Villa Rosa fit into Bumpy's strategy of building legitimate wealth alongside illegal wealth, explains Green. He knew that criminal enterprises were risky, subject to police crackdowns, vulnerable to competition. But real estate and legitimate businesses were more stable. If his illegal operations got shut down, he'd still have income from properties and businesses. The personal satisfaction Johnson derived from owning Villa Rosa is documented through numerous conversations and observations recorded by people who knew him during those years. He took friends and associates to dinner there, regularly. He introduced the restaurant to visiting criminals from other cities as evidence of his success. He spoke with pride about the quality of the food, the service, the atmosphere. For a man who controlled millions of dollars in illegal gambling operations, the $18,000 restaurant mattered perhaps more than the money suggested it should. Bumpy loved Villa Rosa in a way that was different from how he felt about his other businesses, says Pettigrew. The numbers banks were necessary. The real estate was strategic. But Villa Rosa was personal. It represented something he'd been denied and then taken. Every time he ate there, every time he brought someone there for dinner, He was reliving that moment on December 15th, 1936, when he walked away from being told he wasn't welcome, and then reminding himself that 3 days later he owned the place. The reaction of Harlem's religious and civic leaders to Johnson's ownership of Villa Rosa was mixed, reflecting the complicated relationship these respectable institutions had with Harlem's most powerful criminal. Some ministers praised the integration of a previously whites-only establishment, seeing it as progress regardless of who achieved it. Others condemned the celebration of a criminal's business success, arguing that Johnson's methods, even his legal methods, were not appropriate models for the community. "My father was a minister, and he refused to eat at Villa Rosa," remembers Reverend James Thompson, CCE. He said that eating there would be endorsing Bumpy Johnson's criminal enterprises, even though the restaurant itself was legitimate. But many of his congregation members disagreed. They saw Villa Rosa as a victory for the community, not just for Bumpy. They saw integration as more important than the specific person who achieved it. The decades following the Villa Rosa acquisition, the years between 1936 and Johnson's death in 1968, saw countless similar instances of Johnson using his economic power to challenge discrimination, support Negro businesses, and demonstrate that money and power could achieve in Harlem what moral arguments alone couldn't achieve in the rest of America. But Villa Rosa remained the most talked about example because it was the first, because it happened so quickly, and because it demonstrated so clearly the transformation of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, from the hungry boy from Charleston to the man who owned Harlem in every meaningful sense. "When people ask me what defined Bumpy Johnson's power," says Henderson, "I tell them about Villa Rosa. Not the biggest deal he ever made, not the most money he ever made, but the most perfect demonstration of what power actually meant in 1936 Harlem. The power to be told you're not welcome and to respond by purchasing the place that rejected you. The power to transform humiliation into ownership in 72 hours. Today, walking past the corner of 116th Street and Pleasant Avenue in East Harlem, you wouldn't know that Villa Rosa ever existed. The building was demolished in 1978 as part of urban renewal projects that transformed much of East Harlem's physical landscape. But the story remains. The story of 3 days in December 1936. The story of a maitre d' who said, "We don't serve coloreds here," and found himself, 72 hours later, serving those same customers as employees of the man he'd turned away. The story of Angelo Benedetti, who woke up Wednesday morning owning a restaurant and went to sleep Friday evening with $18,000 in cash and no business. The story of Bumpy Johnson, who converted discrimination into ownership so swiftly that it became legend before it was even history. And at the center of the story is a truth about power that remains relevant decades later. In America in 1936, equality couldn't always be demanded through moral argument. Sometimes it had to be purchased. And when it was purchased by someone with enough money, enough connections, and enough determination to close a real estate deal in 72 hours just to prove a point, that purchase echoed through the community as loudly as any protest, any speech, any legislation. Perhaps more loudly, because it was tangible, it was permanent. It was written on a deed that said Bumpy Johnson owned Villa Rosa. And nobody, not racist maitre d's, not discriminatory policies, not assumptions about where Negro men were welcome, could take that ownership away. The boy who arrived in Harlem in 1919 with nothing had become, by December 1936, a man who could buy anything in Harlem he wanted, including especially the things that people foolishly told him he couldn't have. That was power. That was revenge. That was Bumpy Johnson. And Villa Rosa was where he proved it in a way that everyone could see, everyone could understand, and nobody could deny.